This is lecture 2, part 1, in which we're going to introduce utilitarianism. The key for discussion of utilitarianism is the distinction between pleasure or happiness versus pain or suffering. Consequences is what utilitarian theory is all about. Consequences as opposed to intentions. The point of utilitarianism is that happiness is to be maximized in the world. And happiness minus suffering, since there's always some suffering that accompanies acts that bring about happiness, that's what is called utility. And that is really what's at the root of the term utilitarianism. The basic thought of utilitarianism is recognition that, ultimately, pleasure is the only thing that is good in itself, and pain is the only thing that is bad in itself. On this line of thought, when we say that something is good, we mean that it produces pleasure. And when we say that something is bad, we mean that it produces suffering. Everything else is just sentimental or ideological hogwash as far as utilitarians are concerned. Thus, consequences measured by pleasure or pain of actions or anything else is the only thing that matters morally, really, say the utilitarians. But, says the utilitarian, we realize the above after we think about it. Before we think about it, in our usual mode, we talk about happiness or suffering. It is upon reflection that we realize that happiness and suffering are really just pleasure and pain, and that consequences measured in terms of these is the only thing that matters morally. The utilitarian is doing what a philosopher does, looks for the ultimate. In the judgment of the utilitarian, pain and pleasure, or suffering and pain, rather suffering and pleasure, is as ultimate as it gets when we think about the good. The good is just happiness or pleasure. Now, moral action, one that produces the most good, is one that produces the most happiness or pleasure. And most happiness or pleasure is produced by that action which maximizes happiness or pleasure for as many beings as possible. Certainly, if you produce happiness for 100 people by your action, that action has produced more happiness and therefore more good and is therefore more moral than the action that only makes 2 people happy. Moral action, then, is one that produces the most happiness or pleasure for as many beings as possible out of all those actions available at any one time. The good, then, is pleasure and happiness, not simply my pleasure and happiness. That is what makes this thinking objective, impartial, and moral. Same amounts of happiness have the same worth and are to be given equal consideration, whether they happen to be in me or in anyone else, in people I like or not, or even in other animals or beings capable of suffering and happiness. Vegetarianism is a live option for utilitarianism. Whether eating meat causes more happiness or suffering in the world overall is a real question for utilitarians. Of course, actions also produce suffering, inevitably. Whether that is because actions require effort on the part of the doer, or because of the happiness skipped due to other actions that were not done instead, or due to actually causing suffering to other people. The mignonette example will demonstrate that in a moment. But meanwhile, let us say that the best or moral action that produces as much happiness as possible with as little suffering as possible for everyone. And that is what we mean by utility of an action. It is in this sense of utility, it is this sense of utility that is at the root of this entire school of thought, utilitarianism. One other thought before we move on to the mignonette example. According to consequentialism, of which utilitarianism is one version, no action is good or bad in itself, but the goodness of an action depends on the consequences. Thus, the same act can sometimes be good and sometimes bad, depending on the consequences. How many beings are benefited and how many are harmed by that action in those circumstances. Thus, lying, killing, stealing can all, in principle, be sometimes bad and sometimes good morally. Consequentialism is opposed to any kind of absolutism, and the moral meaning of actions really just depends on consequences. Well, the kind of consequentialism that utilitarianism is. I guess it's possible for there to be other consequentialist moral theories for which that is not the case, I think.